Okay, let's dig into this one. Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Is it, the greatest novel ever written, or is it maybe just this sprawling, sometimes really overwhelming historical textbook?
It's definitely a literary Everest for so many people, something you feel you have to climb.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, our mission is basically to pull apart this masterpiece, look at its big themes, how it's structured, its obvious genius, but also, yeah, maybe where it falls short sometimes. So whether you've actually wrestled with all 1,200 plus pages, or maybe you're just, let's say, Tolstoy curious, stick around.
Well, what's really fascinating about War and Peace is just the sheer scale of its ambition right from the start. Tolstoy wrote it between, 1865 and 1869?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
And that was a time when he himself was going through some pretty significant personal changes, and I think you can really feel that seeping into the book itself.
How so?
Well, it apparently began as maybe a more straightforward historical novel, focused on the 1812 French invasion of Russia, but then it just expanded. It exploded, really.
It became this incredibly profound meditation on history, on destiny, and maybe even on the nature of human existence. It just kept growing.
And the setting is so incredibly vivid, isn't it? You're dropped right into Russia, 1805 to 1812, smack in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, total chaos.
A huge canvas.
And you're following these aristocratic families, mostly the Bezukhovs, the Bolkonskis, the Rostovs, as they're navigating these really intense personal dramas against this, unbelievable historical backdrop. What do you think weaving those together achieves?
That's a great question, because I think it raises this fundamental point right from the get-go. Tolstoy isn't just, telling a story in the usual way.
Right.
He's actually questioning the very mechanics of how history works, how it actually unfolds. We often think of history as like a neat chain of cause and effect, like Napoleon does X, so Y happens.
Sir, the great man theory. Exactly. But Tolstoy challenges that completely.
Yeah.
He argues events are far messier, influenced by countless tiny decisions, individual lives, not just these supposed great men. He's basically saying, hold on, it's not that simple.
And when I was digging into this, the characters just leap off the page. They feel incredibly real, but also somehow more than just real people. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. They function almost like philosophical archetypes, each wrestling with these huge existential questions.
Like Pierre Bezukhov. He starts off so clumsy, awkward, suddenly inherits this fortune, totally confused, very philosophical, just desperately searching for meaning.
He's so relatable in his confusion.
He really is. He kind of represents what you might call the existential man, right? Deeply grappling with life's big questions, feeling torn between having choices and just being swept along by events. We've all felt a bit like Pierre, I think.
Oh.
And then you've got Prince Andrei Bolkonsky. Totally different. A man just completely disillusioned with his aristocratic life, goes off chasing glory in the war.
Only to be completely broken by it.
Yeah. His story is just tragic, isn't it? Very stoic, but also profoundly human. It's this portrait of pride and sacrifice and ultimately these crushed ideals.
Tough journey.
And then there's Natasha Rostova. She's just passion incarnate, young, impulsive, so romantic.
She gets some criticism sometimes, doesn't she? For being naive.
She does get flagged for that, yeah. But I think Tolstoy just brilliantly captures the essence of youth and that painful, often really messy process of growing up through her story. What's the real genius here, do you think, beyond just their individual arcs?
I think it's how Tolstoy strips away maybe the surface glamour of their lives, the aristocratic setting, to get at these really universal human struggles.
Like a search for meaning.
Yeah, the search for meaning, the pain of disillusionment, that messy journey of growth we all go through. If you zoom out a bit, all these characters, they're all grappling with this central question that just haunts the entire novel. How much control do we actually have?
For our own lives.
Exactly. How much control do we, as individuals, really have? It's this deep question that echoes through every single storyline. Pierre's, Andrei's, Natasha's.
And that question really connects to the novel structure too, right? Which is, unique.
Oh, incredibly distinctive. It's constantly shifting between these really vivid personal narrative scenes and then these broad historical essays or philosophical bits.
Yeah, he moves from like an intimate ballroom scene straight into a detailed discussion of military strategy.
And then boom, without warning, you're in these deep metaphysical monologues.
And that fluidity, I think, is both the novel's absolute brilliance and maybe its biggest challenge for readers. The pacing can shift so fast.
It can be whiplash-inducing.
1 minute, you're totally absorbed in a tense duel. The next minute, Tolstoy is basically, lecturing you about why Napoleon wasn't actually that important. It's jarring, but also kind of amazing.
It absolutely is. And that structural choice is completely deliberate. It lets Tolstoy break free from the usual constraints of a novel.
He's doing more than just telling a story.
Much more. He's making this profound argument about how history itself operates, challenging our usual ideas about historical causality. That idea that one thing neatly leads to the next. He's showing us it's way more complex, more chaotic.
So let's talk about what this all means for the big themes. First, and maybe the most famous one, is that clash. Free will versus determinism.
The big one.
And tied into this, Tolstoy famously rejects that whole great man theory of history. The idea that powerful individuals like Napoleon are the sole drivers of big events.
Okay. He argues against that forcefully.
Instead, he argues history is really the chaotic sum of countless, almost invisible small actions, and individuals are basically just caught in this uncontrollable tide.
And what's fascinating there is Tolstoy's obsession with the role of pure chance, or maybe luck.
Yeah. Where do you see that?
But you see it really clearly with Pierre, who seems to survive battles not through heroism, but often just sheer dumb luck.
Right. He just sort of stumbles through.
And Prince Andrei's choices, his personal decisions, they rarely seem to actually change his ultimate fate. It feels almost predetermined sometimes.
It's like trying to steer a tiny boat in a hurricane.
Kind of. It's like looking at a huge wave. We see the crest and think, wow, that one wave caused all this movement. But Tolstoy's saying, no, that wave is just the result of millions of tiny, unseen currents underneath.
So forget great man history.
Exactly. He's basically telling us, forget that narrative. History just happens, almost despite our intentions sometimes. It really forces you to rethink how any historical event actually unfolds.
Another really powerful theme, for me anyway, was the emptiness of glory.
Oh, absolutely.
Prince Andrei's constant chase for heroism, for glory, where does it lead him? Only to deep, profound disillusionment.
Tolstoy completely strips war of any romantic notions. He shows it as chaotic, brutal.
And often just utterly pointless. He shows the real cost, not the parades and medals.
And yet, through all that chaos and disillusionment, there's this really pervasive theme of spiritual growth.
Especially with Pierre and Natasha.
Yeah. By the end, both Pierre and Natasha seem to find this profound sense of peace, not through ambition or status, but in, well, simpler things.
Family, faith.
Family, faith, simplicity. Tolstoy suggests that true fulfillment maybe lies more in that inward transformation, rather than chasing external achievements.
Yeah, Pierre's journey really hammers that home.
It does. When I think about Pierre, it always reminds me that maybe true peace often comes when we just stop chasing all that external validation and embrace the simpler, more human connections. Tolstoy really nails that universal truth.
Okay, but let's be honest. War and Peace isn't perfect. We have to acknowledge that. No literary Everest is a smooth climb all the way.
Indeed not. And there are common criticisms. One is definitely about those final chapters.
The epilogue, yeah.
Yeah, the second epilogue especially. It veers heavily into pure philosophy, and some readers find it, well, preachy or even a bit redundant.
It feels like he abandons the story.
A bit. Tolstoy seems to abandon his characters to really hammer home his theories about historical causality. Intellectually interesting, maybe, but dramatically.
Yeah.
It can feel unsatisfying after spending so much time with these people.
What else?
Well, there's also the fact that the novel is overwhelmingly male in its perspective. The female characters are vivid, definitely, but often confined to pretty traditional roles.
Right. Natasha's destiny is primarily domestic.
And some readers also pick up on a noticeable moralism throughout the book that can feel a bit prescriptive at times, like Tolstoy is telling you how to live.
That's a fair point about the ending feeling preachy. I know that jars a lot of readers. But maybe for Tolstoy, switching to pure philosophy was the point. A deliberate choice.
That's possible, almost like a statement in itself, perhaps.
Yeah, like he's saying the ideas are ultimately bigger than even these incredible characters he created.
Could be. He was certainly less interested in tying things up neatly and more focused on grappling with these huge philosophical questions. But zooming out again, even with those criticisms, War and Peace is just... it's a towering achievement.
It's more than just a novel.
Oh, much more. It's this incredibly ambitious attempt to capture the whole sweep of human life. War, peace, love, death, politics, philosophy, faith, failure, It's all in there.
Its influence is undeniable, too.
Immense. You can see its shadow on so many modern epics. Think about something like Game of Thrones with its sprawling cast and political intrigue, or even classics like Les Miserables.
Yeah.
They owe a debt to Tolstoy's scope.
And people are still arguing about it.
Absolutely. Scholars continue to debate its profound ideas about history, about human agency, about everything, really. It still feels relevant.
So the big question for you listening, is War and Peace actually worth the read? My answer is yes, absolutely. But with a caveat.
Not beach reading.
Definitely not. It's not a casual book. It really demands your patience, reflection, a serious commitment. You might feel like you fought your own war just getting through it sometimes.
Maybe.
But if you give it your time, I genuinely think it will change the way you think about history, about fate, maybe even about yourself.
And, Leo Tolstoy himself once said something very relevant here. The strongest of all warriors are these two, time and patience.
Fitting.
It is. So as you think about tackling this literary giant, or even just processing the ideas we've explored today, I'd encourage you to hold on to that thought. Consider time and patience, not just for reading the book, but in the context of your own life and the big questions Tolstoy raises.